very warm welcome to CIPR East Anglia's annual conference on behavioural science. We're absolutely delighted to have you here this afternoon. Just please bear with us a minute while everyone arrives. I can see the numbers ticking up, nearly 70 on the call. We have over 100 people signed up this afternoon. So just give everyone a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Let's know where you're joining from today. Obviously, we are the CIPR committee for the East Anglia region, but this is the beauty of online events like this. We can and often do welcome people from far and wide, so let us know where you're joining from. Yeah, definitely from beyond the region. It's great. Sunny here in London as well, I'm pleased to report. Okay. While the last few people join, I'll make a start so we can keep to time this afternoon. We do want to finish promptly at 5 o'clock. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to CIPR East Anglia's 2022 annual conference. You can imagine with everything that's been going on the last couple of years, we debated long and hard if we should host our conference, if we should do so in person or online. And in the end, common sense and desire to make this event as accessible as possible prevailed, and here we all are. Behavioural science was one of the topics you asked for in your feedback from last year's conference, and it's clearly a hot one, as we're absolutely delighted to be welcoming well over 100 of you from across the region and beyond this lovely, mostly sunny, I think, afternoon. And we're really in for a treat. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers who've generously agreed to give their time pro bono to share their knowledge and experience on different facets of behavioural science. First of all, apologies on behalf of two of our speakers who sadly can't join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. That's Grania Dickerson and Dominic Ridley-Moy. They're very sad and sorry to be missing, so we wish them both very well. That said, absolutely delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Laura de Molière, who's Head of Behavioural Science at the Cabinet Office. Welcome, Laura. Give us a wave. Thank you. Michael Travers from Norfolk County Council. Michael's Communications Manager over there, and CEO and founder of Lynn PR, Shayoni Lynn. So please do give us a wave if you're here already. Before we start, just a few quick, boring housekeeping points. Please note all the sessions are being recorded, and we'll share links to the recordings and the slides after the conference. We have enabled closed captions as well, so please feel free to turn those on. You can do that by navigating to settings, clicking the meeting tab, and then enabling captions under in meeting advanced. For questions, please use the Q&A button, and please feel free to do that as we go through this afternoon. There will be a little bit of time after each speaker to deal with some of the questions, but we've also got a panel session at the end of the afternoon where we can try and mop up any that haven't been answered. And we're on Zoom webinars, so you may well be familiar with this feature. You can vote for your favorite questions, and of course we'll prioritize the most popular ones. So questions in the Q&A, and then please use the chat to comment and engage with each other. Some of the value this afternoon is the networking that we can do online. So please do jump in there. It's lovely to see a lively chat kicking off already. And please do join in with the conversation on Twitter. We'll be live tweeting throughout the afternoon using the hashtag EABehave. We will be taking a 10-minute break at 15:10, so please remain logged in for this period. And finally, the conference is worth 5 CPD points, so do remember to log those while the event is fresh in your mind. So just very quickly, I'm going to move us on to the agenda. So we start with our keynote, Laura. Laura's going to take us through for an hour. We were going to have Dominic next, but Dominic not being here, it's allowed Laura to spend a bit more time with us this afternoon, which is great. Sorry, apologies, last minute adjustments to the timing. I think I said the break was 15:20. That's going to end at 15:20. The break will start at 15:10, so you'll get a little 10-minute pause there. And then we'll hear from Michael with his case study from Norfolk County Council. And last but certainly not least, Shayoni Lynn at 15:50. Quick panel discussion and a sharp close at 1700. So without any further ado, I'm very delighted to hand over to my colleague, James Sharp, who will introduce Laura for us. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Laura de Molière to conference today as our keynote speaker. Her talk today will focus on using PR to change behaviour, tackling disinformation and unintended behavioural consequences. As Ruth said, hopefully at the end of this session, we have some time for some questions, so do pop them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom window. And obviously, Laura's staying on for the Q&A at the end as well. Before I hand over to Laura, just a little bit about her expertise on this subject. Laura is founder and head of behavioural science in the UK Government's Communication Service, part of the UK Cabinet Office. Laura holds a PhD from UCL in Decision Sciences and Social Cognition and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the same university. She's co-authored the Principles of Behaviour Change Communications and In Case publication, and successfully embeds behavioural science in campaigns and policy initiatives across UK government and beyond, which I'm sure we'll hear lots more about today. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? And can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for having me today, this nice afternoon. I'm really looking forward to spending a bit of time with you. I think I'm quite pleased that I get to talk a little bit longer, because otherwise you'd have heard my German accent speed up quite significantly throughout the session. I'll be taking it nice and steady as we go through this. So yeah, as I was just introduced, I'm heading the behavioral science team in the UK government's Cabinet Office, where I work with a bunch of really talented people, and most of the work that I'm presenting you today is done in collaboration or by them. So I was thinking a lot about how to focus this talk, and I'm just sharing with you things that I'm really excited about. The first thing I'm really excited about is how we go beyond nudging. So I think we've probably moved the field on a little bit beyond nudging, but what's after that? And I'll be sharing with you two of my recent favorite pieces of work, a framework to counter disinformation and to reduce behavioral risk. So this is kind of my outline. Behavioral science, where do we come from, where do we go? If I don't do anything, at least I've given you a Cotton Eye Joe earworm at this point. We'll be then talking through behavioral risk, the in-case framework, and then wall of beliefs to countering disinformation. And as was said before, there'll be lots of time to ask questions as well. So my team originally was founded, or I founded the team in 2019 to support the Get Ready for Brexit campaign, the campaign to date that had the largest spend since the Second World War on any campaign. And ever since, the team has worked as a consultancy function across many major campaigns and policy initiatives in the UK government and for international partners. Obviously spent a lot of time on COVID, but also on many other different topics. Our work is quite fast-paced, as a lot of kind of crisis response work, consultancy more generally, and capability building and R&D, some of which I'll share with you today. But before I start, and apologies for a slightly stretched trailer, I ended the slide just quickly now, once I realized I'll have more time. I wanted to kind of have us step back a little bit before we start to think about the different kinds of behavioral science, behavioral insights, behavioral economics. You'll all have heard lots of different terminology associated with it, I'm sure. And we think, or actually we know that all these terms lead back to two questions that Richard Thaler has asked. And we know that he asked that because one of us actually cornered him at a conference and checked with him. And the first question Richard asked was, what would economics look like with more plausible assumptions? And that was sort of the birth of behavioral economics. So it's making economics work a little bit better with assumptions about how humans actually behave. The second question was, most policymaking is dominated by economists. And what would that actually look like if we gave psychologists and others a voice? And there were a couple of different answers to that. So behavioral science has always been quite deeply embedded in public health. So the public health psychology has a long-standing tradition of considering behaviors very clearly. So that answer was kind of there. The other answer came in the form of behavioral insights, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more in a second, strongly associated with nudging. And then the third answer came in the form of what I call upstream behavioral science, which is what I'm practicing. And I'll tell you more about the distinction between the two and why I'm doing one and not the other. So behavioral insights and nudging is probably kind of one of the very early ways in which, teams were formed in government to actually support communications and policy with the use of psychology and other disciplines. What behavioral insights kind of is associated with is to replicate interventions that have been used elsewhere. So we know an intervention works somewhere. Like I say here on the right-hand side, you see the fly in the urinal, and we can apply that intervention and apply it across different contexts and see whether it works. That it's testable through trials, often with multiple treatments, usually quite focused on solutions implemented via communications. So the two examples I'm showing you here on the right-hand side are more or less an exception. So for example, having smaller plates leading to fewer, in a canteen leading to fewer calories consumed, and the fly in the urinal so that men have something to aim for and there's less spillage. It often produces kind of quick and non-legislative wins at quite low costs. That's how they're being marketed. And it has a very strong focus on cognitive biases and heuristics, often also marketed with counterintuitive findings. Now, there are a couple of problematic things associated with that approach, which led me, when I founded the team, even though there was a big assumption that I would found the team around some of these principles. And, it is really interesting. And people go, oh my God, can you just tell me some of these insights, some of these cognitive tricks that you can apply to get people to do what we want. But I really strongly stepped away from that because, for a start, the issue is with this kind of approach that it encourages to think about kind of often quite single behaviors in isolation. So we are often just looking at one single target behavior and we're throwing 2-3 different treatments at it to see what sticks. Sometimes big problems need big solutions, and you'll be well familiar with this scenario that you are asked to run a campaign or to put out a piece of communications to change behavior when you can't really do that with comms, right? So a lot of the times comms is sort of at the receiving end for having to make it work when the policy, the structures, the operational processes, the systems actually are super much in the way and you can't really do it with comms. The biggest problem for me with this approach, though, is that a lot of the effects and a lot of what we think is the knowledge underlying nudging and behavioral insights is built on a really fragile science. So here is what we see is a very sad graph where I think in 2014, a bunch of people went out and thought, okay, we're just going to have this big project now where we're replicating the 100 most famous studies in psychology. 3 didn't work out. They ended up with 97. And when I say famous studies in psychology, I mean kind of the basic, studies where we've, founded lots and lots and lots of further research on, and where lots and lots of nudges are founded on. And you can see that from these 97 studies, actually only 35 replicated under the same condition. So let alone in a different context, which just shows us that the field is a little fragile. I just showed you the example with the 2 plates, like a smaller plate leading to fewer calories consumed. That was one example of a study that was actually conducted under fraudulent circumstances where we can't trust the data anymore. And I don't know how many of you follow the kind of latest news in behavioral science, but it also just turned out that one of the most famous studies about reducing fraudulent behaviors where, have a signature at the beginning rather than at the end, which, was meant to kind of decrease your levels of kind of appetite for making a fraudulent choice, that was ironically also fraudulently conducted. So the science underlying all the effects that we kind of see, and a lot of them that are so interesting as well, is just a little shaky. What's less shaky, though, are the methods and approaches that behavioral science gives you to understand behaviors and explore them in your own context. And that's what I focused on with our team. So I realized quite quickly that actually a lot of the nudge stuff, is really well known by marketeers. Like a lot of these things you guys have done for 25 years, and it was kind of resold back to you under a slightly more fancy name. But then some of the extra stuff is just not holding quite so well. So instead, and the problem with some of this is also that it produces an awkward view of humans. I don't know if you've noticed this, but when you're talking to someone that is really keen on nudging, or that someone that has just kind of dove into the field a little bit, you might hear them say things like, people are so irrational, or complain like people make such bad decisions, and having assumptions like, oh my God, people will really panic if we tell them this, and they make so many mistakes. And what that kind of view of humans does is creates a difference between you and your audience, when actually you should probably be asking questions like, this must be a difficult decision for people. What competing priorities might they have? Making sure we test our assumptions, and starting from a position where we think people usually try to do the best that they can. And it was that side of things that I wanted to really surface with my practice, and moving policymakers, communicators away from viewing humans as irrational and biased towards actually being curious and to try and understand what behaviors are like from their perspective. So this kind of applied or upstream behavioral science does usually a couple of different things. For a start, it's kind of a strategic tool to, first of all, have project aims. So kind of any piece of communication that we will have ever done actually will have had underlying it a behavior change aim. We can discuss this later if someone has some different examples. I strongly believe if all of them have actually underlying behavior change aims. So that's really important. It's also important to not consider just one behavior, but to consider many different kinds of behaviors, because usually to achieve a project aim, there are many different people involved, many different actors, and each of them have quite a few different kinds of behaviors. Behavior science then gives us the tools to actually analyze barriers to behavior change, really important step, which we've done with the COM-B framework, many of you will be familiar with that. And then supporting with the sign-off interventions and campaigns. And behavioral science also then sometimes helps with the evaluation of it, sort of through running randomized control trials and making sure we're measuring behavior change. But that's by no means always the case. So I think I want to move us along from associating behavioral science quite strongly with RCTs. It's certainly associated, but a lot of behavioral science is done upstream in the kind of problem definition space that doesn't way beyond before an RCT could ever be run. My team, for example, doesn't run RCTs at all. I'll leave that to the very smart analysts in Cabinet Office and wider government. So the question is, where do we go from here, right? So we kind of moved on, actually, hold on, this was the slide I want to show. We moved on from having behavioral insights to, get people to do what we think is good for them, towards behavior science to actually understand behaviors and needs in systems and contexts. That has been kind of a big move over the last 5 years or so. But underlying both of these approaches are the questions, how can we get people to do X? But this is the question I get asked the most. How can we get people to do engage in a certain behavior? And the question is, are these the only questions we can answer? And I think we can answer a few more. I think that behavioral science can, in the future, be applied to change and improve our internal decision-making processes. So wherever you're working, to actually improve how decisions are being made so that we can make better assumptions about behaviors. What I mean with that is not to kind of apply behavioral science to internal behaviors per se, even though that's, like a field that's definitely growing. What I mean by that is that rather than just start getting behavioral scientists involved where we're going, oh, we need people to do something, actually have behavioral science involved much earlier to think about, is this the right strategy? What are we trying to achieve? And I am going to share with you 2 frameworks that we've developed recently to help us move in this direction a little bit. So you see, it's very far from how do we get people to do X question. It answers different kinds of questions. And I'm really excited by that. And I hope you are too. So I'll start by sharing with you our way of mitigating behavior risk called the in-case framework. And I start off with one of my favorite examples of behavioral risks, which is about, I think it's over 100 years ago or so, when in Delhi, like I said, a while ago, they had a big cobra problem. So lots of cobras were in the city of Delhi, and the back then British government had a very clever idea. So they thought, we are going to put a bounty on the snakes' heads so that people will kill the snakes and bring them to us for money. And that's exactly what happened. People were bringing dead snakes, they were getting money, and all was good, or so it seemed. But actually, it turned out that a lot of people had started to breed cobras for the profit. So they were breeding the cobras to get the money and, you know, start again. When the British government realized that that was what had happened, they immediately stopped the bounty, of course, not realizing then what would happen next is that all the now worthless snakes were released back into the city of Delhi, leading to a much bigger snake problem than they had before. And I really quite like these kind of examples because I think we are surrounded by them often without realizing it. So whenever you are intervening in a complex system, you're communicating in a complex system, and the real world is always complex, there'll be unintended consequences, right? So you can't always predict exactly how people will respond and react to your piece of communication. And sometimes these unintended consequences can be positive, so serendipities, or they can be negative. And the consequences can be psychological, reputational, social, there can be opportunity costs, or they can impact equality. Importantly, though, these kind of consequences can actually impact the success of your intervention or impact another area that you really might care about. So one thing I've been doing over the last few years is to be really mindful when I think behavioral scientists are bringing something to the table that is not naturally already there. And especially during COVID, our team having to work extremely fast to incredible deadlines. I mean, talking a couple of hours, you know, like inputting really, really quickly. A lot of what we were doing was to de-risk campaigns and policy, to say what could actually happen here, and then how can we mitigate that? And once I realized that that's a lot of what we're doing, we thought we should try and formalize some of our thinking a little bit so that it becomes accessible to everyone. And this is where we came up with the in-case model. In-case stands for intended behavior, non-target audiences, compensatory behaviors, additional behaviors, signaling, and emotional impact. And I don't know why I animated it such that each came out one by one, because I am actually going to talk you through them in turn and give you some examples. So we're starting with the intended behavior, which is an interesting one, because that is asking the question, what consequences might occur if the campaign actually delivers the intended behavior change? So even when your campaign does exactly what it's ought to do, it can lead to unintended consequences if the relevant systems or processes or places or services don't actually have the capacity to cope with the new level of frequency of the behavior change. Let me give an example. Imagine a local authority campaign publicizes a recycling helpline. Your goal is achieved. People call the helpline to learn more about recycling. Everyone's happy. But then there is an unforeseen factor. More people than anticipated actually ring the helpline, which then leads to the unintended consequences that the quality of the service drops and complaints are received. So it's about thinking what actually happens if people do exactly as they're told. What kind of consequences could we have from that? The second one, the second letter in case stands for non-target audiences, which I think is highly important. So what might people outside the target audience think or do in response to this campaign? It's very likely that people outside your target audience will actually see the campaign or hear about the intervention. So then you might actually impact behaviors from a group you had never thought of before as someone that you would accidentally impact. And this is an interesting one because we see this a lot, I think, particularly around kind of gender interventions. I had a look at like a big systematic review on kind of lots of the kind of gender decreasing violence against women and girls and so on. And a lot of the times what we'll have are interventions targeted at women, particularly in kind of impoverished contexts where, say, you're giving them money or an education, but you'll get such strong responses that are often unmanaged from the broader communities or the husbands in their lives. And that's kind of a really big example of one that can lead to, a real negative consequence for women as well. But here's a lighter example. Imagine a financial incentive is offered to encourage people to install solar panels. People without solar panels hear about the incentive and they install their solar panels as a result. Goal achieved. But an unforeseen factor is that those who already have solar panels also might hear about the incentive. And the unintended consequence could be that they replace their solar panels early in their lifespan to claim the incentive, which wouldn't be particularly helpful with regards to this policy. A third kind of unintended behavioral consequence is are compensatory behaviors. So how might people seek to compensate for the suggested behavior change? By engaging in undesirable behaviors. For example, an organization establishes a random drug testing to deter employees from using drugs, and people end up becoming afraid of getting caught by a random drug test. So fewer employees fail the drug test, and the firm thinks, great, we've achieved our aim. What actually happened, though, is that the unforeseen factor is that cannabis stays longer in the system than harder drugs like cocaine. And then those who want to use recreational drugs switch from using cannabis to using cocaine, which will lead to fewer employees failing the drug test because the drug tests don't actually pick up on cocaine. But of course, the big unintended consequence is that now people who are using cannabis might now be using more harmful drugs. These kind of compensatory behaviors we see a lot. It's really important in the areas of sustainability where, say, we're encouraging people to install LEDs because they're better for the environment. But LEDs are also cheaper, and they have a cheaper light, and people end up replacing the LEDs, but then actually they're installing many more of them to have more light in the house because it's so cheap. So that happens unfortunately quite a lot. Then there is a category of additional behavior. So they could actually directly undermine your objective or support the objective, or it might be separate additional behaviors and that impact things that you care about. And they can also these kind of behaviors you can also caused by a change in an individual self-perception. So people now perceiving themselves as someone because they've engaged in new behaviors, say, you've suddenly turned me or you turned your friend into a vegan by eating less meat. They perceive themselves as a more healthy person, and then the additional behavior could be that they're hitting the gym more. It's those kind of self-perception, self-identity processes that are quite important to consider. Imagine that a local authority launches a campaign to encourage people to shop locally, and then the goal is achieved because more people end up shopping locally. But actually the additional thing is that due to poor transport links, people have to drive into the town center, which is your unforeseen factor. And then there's congestion and pollution in the town center. So whilst you achieved your aim because more people shop locally, you've actually have a problem in another area because you don't want pollution in your city. This one's also really important. It's what we call signaling. So what signals does the campaign actually send about the current situation in the messenger? So whenever you're putting out a piece of communication, you also, apart from the actual communication, you're sending out a signal to whoever you're communicating to, what behaviors are currently happening, what behaviors the government or others wish to encourage, and the type of relationship between either the government or wherever you're communicating from and your target audience. So some of these signals can drown out the intended message and can lead to people believing or feeling certain things that lead to unintended behavioral consequences. For example, if at a university campus, you read any student found to be under the influence of alcohol will be immediately disciplined, this might well be that it signals the university will not tolerate excessive drinking. And your goal is achieved because students monitor their drinking habits and cut down their consumption. But it also might signal that the university is taking a quite authoritative stance rather than a caring stance about alcohol consumption, which means that those students who have difficulty with alcohol might avoid seeking support from the university as a result. Because we're sending these signals all the time, this is really something to kind of consider in quite a lot of depth. And then finally, emotions. I know lots of communicators are really quite a big fan of emotions. I think I'm like the grumpy person because I'm usually not such a big fan of emotions in campaigns, but that might just be because I'm a German scientist with a cold heart. But I just think emotions can be quite unpredictable. Negative emotions in particular, like fear, they can lead in some circumstances to disengagement from the message or lead to maladaptive behaviors. Similarly, if you have a very authoritative message that is almost a perceived threat to an individual's freedom or identity, it can evoke what we call psychological reactance, which means that people in the end are less likely to engage in your behavior than they were before. Very unfortunate, that is. Imagine a campaign is trying to increase the uptake of smear tests, and it runs a TV advert with alarming statistics. We've all seen some of those, right? I mean, smoking packages, cigarette packages, a good example, very alarming statistics. So people realize that cervical cancer is a real risk, and your uptake of cervical screening increases in an ideal world. But what might actually happen is that the statistic frightens people, and the target audience might mute the advert as it appears and disengage with the campaign materials. And then people will not end up booking their cervical screening. So I hope that I've given you a bit of an overview in terms of kind of how we internally have started to engage with unintended behavioral consequences as one of the examples where we're moving away from the question, how can we get people to do X, towards a broader spectrum of decisions that we are looking at and trying to influence with the use of behavioral science. And with that, I will now move on to the final part of the session on countering disinformation. This is actually one of the first time we're sharing this. So you are a little bit our how do you call it? Laboratory test people, because we will be publishing the Wall of Beliefs framework officially very soon, but are currently in a place where we are kind of still consulting and getting a little bit of feedback. So anything you have, more than happy to receive it. So when it comes to countering mis and disinformation, you'll be familiar with quite a lot of different approaches. So for a start, I mean, we all know that particularly in the current climate, disinformation and false stories are quite a big growing threat. And confronting and correcting myths and misconceptions can seem like the right thing to do. That's a really human tendency. You see something wrong, you see an error, you want to say something, and communicators in particular are going to communicate. Very strong urge. But the problem is, and kind of a lot of kind of what we see with regard to how disinformation is being dealt with right now is with myth busting and rebuttals and narratives, counter narratives, like very strongly based in the intuition that we need to correct what's wrong. But these kind of approaches aren't always appropriate. In certain circumstances, they might fail to do anything, or worse, they might backfire. It's because it's quite tricky to directly confront false information. For a start, if you're correcting false stories, you can actually end up accidentally amplifying them. You bring them to a wider audience and you're making them more memorable. So the more people are hearing certain bits of information, particularly in different contexts throughout their lives, the more fluently you're processing them, and the more likely are you to think that it's true. So it might backfire like that. It can also actually signal that there are two legitimate sides to a debate, increasing the perception that there is a genuine controversy rather than just one piece of untrue information. And also when people feel that some of their deeply held beliefs are being directly challenged, they may become defiant and resistant. And as a result, some of these strategies like correcting, myth-busting, rebuttals can have, again, unintended consequences. The key assumptions that is underlying most of these approaches is that the core reason for false beliefs is a lack of true information, which usually in turn then suggests that if you're providing this true information, this will be enough to overturn misconceptions. But one thing that we wanted to do is bring to life that beliefs and belief structures are just so much more complicated than that. And if we are actually appreciating some of this complexity and understanding things like identity, culture, relationships, ideology, or what we call our sacred values, if that comes into it, then it might lead us to different kinds of solutions. In a very experimental matter, I am now going to show you a video. I hope it plays. And I hope you'll have some way of telling me if it's not, but earlier in a test, it worked out. So let me know if it doesn't. Let me let it buffer for just 1 second. No, go back.
Imagine that our beliefs are like the bricks that make up a wall. Altogether, these bricks make a sturdy wall. We might have beliefs about ourselves, beliefs about others, and beliefs about the world around us. Some bricks will be given by friends, family, or other trusted sources. These bricks might be very important to people. Trying to remove a single brick may be impossible, or it may cause a collapse. You might have to remove and replace several bricks to fit a new brick in. Some bricks might be very stuck in place, while others are looser and easy to remove. Rearranging and rebuilding the wall is tiring and takes effort that people don't always have. When trying to adjust a brick, consider the surrounding and supporting bricks. What bricks does it depend on? What other bricks depend on it? If you are trying to replace or remove a brick, help people rebuild the right part of their wall easily. You can also challenge harmful behaviors without moving any bricks. We want to help people build strong and sturdy walls that can be rebuilt easily when we learn new things.
So, like I said, the video will be published properly soon, and we'll also have a big document that explains everything. But let me talk you through what kind of solution are suggested once we've taken a view that beliefs are like bricks of a wall and that we can't just remove single beliefs usually. So what we've put together is a bit of a strategy matrix, because we think that there's kind of two key factors that kind of describes how beliefs can be described. First, we have beliefs that are more embedded into the wall of beliefs and beliefs that are less embedded. So more deeply embedded, meaning depending on, it's harder to remove that brick, might depend on more other beliefs to hold it in place. Then we need to also always look at the behavior that's being caused by this false belief. So you can have beliefs causing really quite harmful behaviors, and the belief that the 2020 US election was illegitimate was really deeply embedded into the walls of these people, but it also led to incredibly harmful behaviors, as you remember with the storming, as well as beliefs that are not actually causing harmful behaviors. And what we are suggesting is that each of these will have a different kind of approach to it. So the belief being more embedded into the walls might be that of climate change deniers, but they, as a small group of people in the overarching kind of problem of climate change, their behaviors are as harmful as they might be. I believe in astrology is usually not that embedded into the wall of beliefs, and the belief does usually not really cause harmful behaviors. Or we might have the belief in a false COVID-19 cure. You might remember that Donald Trump advocated for this drinking this weird stuff, which potentially was incredibly harmful because it could kill people. But in the end, it was such an outrageously weird claim that people themselves didn't believe as strongly in it, at least to start off with. So we can map the beliefs onto this framework. And then what we're saying is that there are probably 4 cases you'll end up with. Those where beliefs are more embedded into the existing wall, but the belief does not cause harmful behavior. We suggest that that's the case for proactive promotion. So amplifying a clear overarching narrative. And I go into each of these in detail. If you have a belief that does not cause harmful behavior and the belief is less embedded into the existing wall, that's your position to do nothing. You watch and you wait. You watch, it's important though, because these beliefs, they can become more embedded over time, or they can lead to harmful behaviors over time. But it's a watch and wait approach at this stage. If the belief causes very harmful behavior and the belief is less embedded into the existing wall, that's where we can have this reactive response that people often have for loads of other cases as well, like rebut and challenge the harmful beliefs directly. But if we're in a situation where we have a very deeply embedded belief, as well as the belief causing a very harmful behavior, that's probably where we want to concentrate on managing behaviors. We've focusing on behaviors first and addressing beliefs later that might be quite tricky to change. So let me give you examples for each of them. In the case of proactive promotions, it's when the beliefs are highly embedded but not causing harmful behaviors. At that point, we're advocating for a counterbrand response. So establishing a clear, consistent narrative that's easy to understand, remember, and share. So it's really important to not have really complicated truths, which is another big issue that we're sometimes facing with false beliefs, is that often the truths are really complicated and the falsehoods are really, the false beliefs are really easy to understand. So we have to make sure we make it easy. Reinforce and amplify true information, and helping people develop accurate mental models and stable walls instead. So when we using the strategy is, for example, to challenge the public belief that the government is not acting on climate change. So that's one of these cases where at the moment the resulting behaviors for individual citizens might not be as harmful, but of course it could become more harmful over time as the kind of role of the public changes. But also we want to make sure that we are enabling people to update their worlds as more information comes through and as we're learning more about climate change and where we're going with all of this. There's also the case where we are kind of managing behaviors. So we're focusing on behavior first, and then we're focusing through proactive promotion on beliefs. That's the case when beliefs are very embedded and are causing harmful behaviors. So these harmful behaviors require a quick response, and undoing some of these embedded bricks takes quite a lot of time. So the strategies that kind of change behaviors without challenges beliefs is probably the best choice at this point. And then once you've addressed the harm, you can shift your attention to this proactive promotion strategy. So for instance, when you have a low uptake of vaccines due to low trust in government, you can use health service to communicate other health messages instead. For example, staying at home when sick. You're challenging certain behaviors without necessarily changing the belief. And then there's the case of watch and wait. If some of these false beliefs don't cause much harm, trying to tackle them might actually just make matters worse. It might amplify them, draw attention, suggest that there are two sides to the debate, and so on. So if astrology, is a popular false belief, a counter-astrology campaign wouldn't make much sense unless people carry out harmful behaviors. So quite important to monitor it, because some beliefs, like astrology, can lead you down a path where you become more and more conspiracy theorists. So it's important to actually monitor the impact of it. But on the surface, that seems to be a case where we probably suggest to watch and wait. And then we have the reactive response. So that's the case where beliefs aren't quite embedded, but cause harmful behaviors. So that's the kind of counter-narrative response, where it's best to challenge beliefs quite quickly and directly. And the only situation where myth busting is actually the best strategy. So you might remember back to this crazy time when Donald Trump suggested drinking this disinfectant to cure COVID-19. high risk of harm, but so new and so strange, best to actually directly debunk it. And you saw that that's what news outlets did very, very intuitively nicely at this point. It was immediately kind of corrected and debunked. So I think I've talked you through this now. We will obviously publish the Wall of Beliefs framework very soon. We're also due to publish a new crisis communications from a behavioral science perspective guide, which you can look out for. But in the meantime, if you're interested in reading up on some of what I discussed on anticipating unintended consequences, the in-case model is already published. And there's also some of more of our foundational work describing how we're applying behavioral science, the principles of behavioral change communications. So if you're a GCS member, you can also, of course, feel free to approach us and see if you want to work with us. But I am trying to stop sharing in a second if I manage, and then more than happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's an absolutely fantastic session, and I'd say there's a lot of love for your video in the chat as well, so take that feedback back. We have got a few questions come in, so if you're happy, I'll go through them now. So the one that's at the top is someone today, when they told someone they was attending a conference about behavioural science, they immediately accused me of learning how to manipulate people. Is this true? Where is the line?
Yeah, so that's something that's people often kind of worry about, the use of ethics in behavioral science. And I'm always super confused by this, because from my perspective, kind of the behavioral science that I advocate for is about understanding people. It's making sure that we're actually addressing their needs. It's making sure that we're not accidentally doing something that causes harm without actually realizing it. And so from that perspective, I think the behavioral science that I stand for is probably the farthest away you can get from manipulation. When instead, you know, what we do have on the other side, I do kind of feel and understand some of the apprehension when it comes to kind of some of the nudges where you think, okay, someone is presenting information to me in such a way that will make me do it, even if my actual beliefs aren't really in line with that. And there's some interesting research on this, which kind of does bring the questions of ethics to point. For instance, when you have defaults, is a really common way is kind of to default someone into, say, a green energy provider. And these kind of defaults, you see them on Ryanair, whenever you're doing, there's always defaults selected. They do have quite strong impacts on people because they signal that it's what's best for you and so on. But I always thought one of the underlying assumptions here is that people will only actually adhere to this default if it's reflecting their true beliefs, right? In other words, if you're someone that cares a lot about the environment, you should be much more impacted by the defaulting you to a green energy provider than someone that doesn't care a lot about the environment. But what we find in this particular example is that it doesn't matter. Irrespectively of whether or not you really believe in, whether or not sustainability is valuable to you or not, you'll be influenced by this nudge just the same. So that does bring into question how transparent we are with people. And I think we can make even these nudges more transparent. For instance, it's been shown that these nudges work just as well if we are actually saying what our aims are. You've been defaulted into a green energy provider because we think this is best for the environment, you know, and people will then still stick to it. So yeah, interesting question. I hope that what you've learned today is not manipulation at all, but obviously important to be on the forefront of this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got another question here around how do you define what is harmful behaviour, and what defines that? Who defines that?
Yeah, so I don't have a kind of super straightforward question to this, but of course, when it comes to harm, you kind of have on top of the hit list, you have something like, you know, causes you physical harm, like drinking a disinfectant can be very harmful to you because it might lead to death. But then there are other kinds of harms that might be important. So as a government, for example, you always have certain objectives, like you want people to stay healthy, you want to, you know, want them to pay their taxes on time and so on. So if you're suddenly seeing behaviors that might like strongly go against some of these government objectives, that's when I would call them harmful. So they go against, you know, what we deem, you know, we need for a working, functioning society, essentially. But actually putting criteria together for that's a really good idea.
Fantastic. I've got a question here around the in-case model. So I find the in-case model fascinating. But sometimes in day-to-day comms, it's very hard to make the case for taking the time to consider unintended consequences. How can we persuade the powers that be of the value of considering them?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think there's a misconception that it should have to take a lot of time. Usually that's where kind of this came from, was that we did this at a lot of speed. So often, like, call it half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, we were putting together these kind of potential risks to surface them. And once they're surfaced, I think it's down to the decision maker and their level of risk appetite, right? So the first step is to surface those risks. The second one is the decision maker has to say, actually, how much can I tolerate this risk, right? How likely is this risk to come true? How much can I tolerate it? And then it's about making the mitigation strategies really easy. For instance, in the recent Violence Against Women and Girls campaign that the Home Office has put out, they used in case to make sure that if a bystander intervenes in say, street harassment, we've considered that, you know, this bystander should not put themselves in a position where they're not safe anymore. And, you know, this might be like certain additions on a poster. If you walk past one of these enough poster, you can identify in case in there. So we have to make it easy as well to mitigate some of these risks. But yeah, it depends on the risk appetite of the decision maker at the end of the day.
Yeah, fantastic. There's a question here around how the pandemic and the associated disinformation, how has the pandemic and the associated disinformation challenged the perception around behavioural science? Do you think people are more conscious of it, and is therefore that becoming harder to apply successfully?
Yeah, so definitely behavioural science has had its moments during the pandemic, the good and the bad. And I think fundamentally it comes down to what I call two kinds of behavioural science. So the British public reacted very, very strongly very early on in the pandemic when there were suggestions made that they wouldn't be motivated enough to engage in all the restrictions. In other words, they reacted against a view of humans that displayed them as panic prone, as someone that couldn't take on board all the information, and so on. So I think I understand the reaction of the British public against some of what behavioral scientists were putting out there. But that's the kind of behavioral science that, for my view, is more strongly associated with behavioral insights, because I was part of CIPR, which was the expert panel of the pandemic on behavioral science. Oh, sorry, Alexa is talking to me. So Alexa says she doesn't know the answer. I hope I do. The other side of behavioral science was what I was part of in CIPR, which was an understanding that actually, if we give people the right information, they will know what to do with it. People aren't prone to panic. They're responding very sensibly to a highly novel situation. There's not going to be, public disorder that we have to care about. We really have to, and we have to appreciate all the barriers that people face in their life to adhere to all of these restrictions. And that is the kind of behavioral science that flourished in government at the time, and that didn't get any pushback because it's centered around a view of humans that's evidence-based, but that's also empathetic to people's environments and constraints, rather than saying you're biased, you have so many biases going on, let me show you what's actually right.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a question here around your plate example that you showed at the beginning of your presentation. Could the initiative of putting calories on restaurant menus be seen as something likely to have unintended consequences? What do you think they might be?
So there's a couple of different things that could happen. I mean, what we already know is that there's quite a lot of pushback against those with eating disorders, against putting calories on the menus, and that people are for them it might be quite difficult to see, and it might actually facilitate more eating disorders. So that would be a big unintended consequence which should be mitigated. The other one is, of course, that if you're going for a restaurant and you are deliberately choosing the less calorific menu food, you might compensate for it later on, and think, oh, I've eaten the salad, so then I can have the chocolate bar instead, if that doesn't have calories kind of as easily accessible. I think we know something that actually could quite happen, which would be a positive and intended consequences if people start learning, getting a better feeling for the calories and the energy that the food have. And over time, I think we'll become slightly more blind to the calories on the menu. We'll probably habituate to an extent, but hopefully at a point in time where we've learned enough about it. But yeah, definitely some to be mitigated.
So a couple more questions. Yeah, we've got some time. Is there a PR behavioural issue around sectors campaigning against draft legislation, which is then simplified by the media, so it sets a narrative against it and then needs to be unpicked once the bills become to acts?
I need to think about what exactly this means. So this is just, what you mean is then kind of, you have you draft legislation, but someone has lobbied against it, and then you'll have its own truth.
I think so. I'm not sure who asked that question. I don't know if we can give us a bit more information.
I mean, it seems like that
seems like
process. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure what the behavioral science aspect of that, other than there be kind of narratives, but also the role of internal government, of course, will be to make sure that the policies are understood correctly, and that we need to make sure that people have and understand the narrative around them. If there is a narrative, a pre-existing narrative that's happening that could pose what we call a barrier to the uptake of the behavior change, then we would need to take that into consideration. So if people, for example, if you'd have a certain motivational barrier then in the way of people engaging the behavior because they've heard a narrative beforehand that kind of discredits it, we'd have to actively address this motivational barrier through, depending on how harmful the behaviors are, but probably likely through kind of a counter-brand response to that. That would be my...
Yeah, I think Kelly's answered that. That's what she was thinking. Yeah, so thank you. We've got another question. Whilst you said you don't use RCTs, do you use real-world data to evaluate the effectiveness of these models?
Yeah, so basically the way it works for our team is that we collaborate really closely with insight and evaluation teams that have access to lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of data, particularly in COVID, and there was quite a big data stream. So yeah, we are always engaging with the evidence that we have. It's just that sometimes you're coming in at decision points where you don't necessarily just have yet evidence. Like unintended consequences is a great example, right? If you're mitigating your unintended consequences successfully, you'll never see light, you never see them because they've been mitigated, right? So we don't really have data unless you're running a randomized control trial where you're testing it first and you're measuring all the unintended consequences, but that might not even be ethical if you can foresee them and mitigate them. So there's not everything can be addressed with this kind of evaluative approach, but yeah, extremely important to understand the data and the evidence out there.
I think we've got most of the questions there. There was another question in here around where people can find more information on these models that you've spoke about today. Is there any books or publications that you'll recommend? I know my colleague Hayley has put some links into some of the GCS publications online.
Yeah, so we've kind of have produced one really kind of extensive guide to the use of behavioral science in communications, which is a little bit more basic than what I've just discussed today. So like, how do you go about defining behaviors? How do we think about kind of barriers to behavior change with the combi model? How do you put a theory of change surrounding this to kind of, keep track of all the different kind of barriers and behaviors, and how do you form a strategy as a response? So that's all explained in the GCS link, but also much more information on in-case and soon to be wall of beliefs.
I think that's all the questions that we've got at the moment. I mean, if anyone has got any more, please do pop them in the chat. If not, Laura will be joining us for our panel at the end of the conference today. I can't see any more that's going back in. So what I'm going to do before we go back to break, Laura, I'm just going to thank you for your time. And it's been an absolutely fantastic session. I mean, I've learned so much as well. My head's buzzing with ideas now to take back to my team. I'm going to hand back to Ruth before we go to break. And yeah, then we'll see you later for the panel. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and thanks, Laura. Yeah, absolutely echo what James has just said. That was fascinating. We've got lots to take away. I think the only thing is, in a really good way, it was like, wow, so much to take on. I think got lots to kind of download and think about. So yeah, I think we're actually amazingly slightly ahead of schedule, which is great. So we will take a break now. And as I said before, do stay logged in. That just makes it easier for us just to pick up straight away after the break without waiting for people to rejoin. And yeah, we're ahead of schedule, but that's fine. We will reconvene at, let's say, we did say 15:20. Michael, if it's okay with you, we'll reconvene at 15:15. Just gives everyone the benefit of an extra 5 minutes on the comfort break. Is that good for you, Michael?
That's absolutely fine, yeah.
Perfect. So 15 minutes, and we'll rejoin at 15:15 to hear from Michael. Many thanks. Okay, see you in a bit.
No one gave you a condensed version of it. I think that was just for information. You don't have to read.
I was just so impressed. I was on a roll.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Shayoni. It's really lovely to have you. So yeah, without any further ado, when you're ready, please do crack on. And we're doing really well with time this afternoon because unfortunately one of our speakers had to drop out at the last moment. So if you do need to run on a little bit, that's okay.
That's
but it
fine.
means we've got plenty of time for questions as well before we go.
Absolutely. I'm going to keep it quite brief and then take questions, which I think is the best way of doing it.
Thank you.
Right, hang on 2 secs. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, great, because I can't see anything now on my screen, so sorry, bear with me 2 secs. Let me try and, brilliant. Fab. So, hello, my name is Shayoni Lynn. I am CEO of now rebranded Lynn. We were previously Lynn PR. And I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about who we are, how we do things using behavioral science in communications. Part of the rebrand was to not reestablish, but reaffirm, I suppose, our commitment to using authentic academic behavioral science in communications. We firmly feel that by using the power of behavioral science, we can reach more audiences, we can engage more audiences, and ultimately we can get them to take life-saving action. So the work we do at Lynn is varied, but underpinning every single piece of work, whether that is within research, whether that is within strategy, whether that's within implementation or evaluation, is behavioral science. So we are Lynn, we are powered by behavioral science. So just to tell you a bit more about how we are set up very briefly, I'm not going to go into it. We work in an integrated manner, and we have 3 services, if you will, across the business. We have the BS unit, which is obviously behavioral science. We have campaigns where we run our multi-award-winning campaigns. They're integrated, they could be digital, all shapes and sizes, forms. And then we have the misinformation cell, which we launched last year in September, which is the UK's first anti-mis disinformation service for the communications industry, and has done quite a lot of work since it was created in September. And we've done a lot of pro bono work for Ukraine, fighting disinformation coming out of the Kremlin. And we also have introduced 3 practice areas at the business. So we have Lynn Health. We have an established track record of success in health at Lynn. So this is our practice to continue to innovate and expand in this particular area. We are ultimately all about improving and saving lives, and Lynn Health is a key part of that mission. Lynn Planet, because we believe climate change is an emergency and it needs transformational change at pace. So Lynn Planet is a dedicated practice that employs systems thinking in finding impactful solutions so we can transition into a sustainable future. And then Lynn Change, and that is us using behavioral science in business transformational and organizational change, because we've seen the pandemic has obviously thrown our world upside down, and businesses and organizations of all kinds are very eager now to adapt in a post-pandemic world. How we work today is not how we worked before the pandemic, and so Lynn Change is here to help organizations not just survive but thrive. That's enough about me and Lynn. I'm here to talk to you about Don't Miss Your Vaccine, which is our already multi-award winning campaign with our Healthier South East London ICS or NHS South East London CCG. It picked up gold for Public Sector Campaign of the Year at PR Moment Awards. It was also recognized as, I'm looking at my award when I look at this, Best Healthcare Pharma Crisis Comms Response for PR Week Healthcare and Pharma Comms Awards, and also highly commended in the Best Content category. Then it's up for CIPR Awards as well coming up. So I don't need to remind anyone about the pandemic, but this campaign was delivered in July of last year. And this is when we were running up to Freedom Day. So we knew at that point that, so the presumption perhaps in public health was when the vaccine program rolled into mass vaccination, that would get a little easier. But instead what we saw was a lower take-up than expected for younger audiences. So in Southeast London, the data indicated there was quite a lot of hesitancy. There were lower levels of take-up amongst younger people, especially ethnic minorities. And we were very aware of this Freedom Day deadline that was coming up. And so our client wanted us to work at pace to reach as many young people under the age of 40, 18 to 39 in Southeast London to get their vaccine. So we were tasked with delivering a behaviorally informed integrated campaign to help improve the vaccine take-up in Southeast London. Apologies. So we had done at this point, so Southeast London CCG is an old client of ours. So we understand that patch really well. We've run several campaigns with them, including Free Your Mind, which is another multi-award winning mental health campaign. But we weren't working with them on vaccinations at this point, but we'd done quite a lot of research on young people and hesitancy to COVID-19 vaccine across England, both qualitative and quantitative. So we had quite a lot of behavioral insights already. And we also had the data insights that we had from Southeast London previous work. So we hit the ground running. We had 1 week to turn around this campaign. It was an integrated campaign in 1 week, which was quite exceptional. But every piece of work we do, no matter how quickly we have to deliver it, no matter what size of the campaign, no matter the budget, follows the Lynn Framework. And the Lynn Framework is a proprietary framework at Lynn. It uses best practice methodologies across strategic communications and behavioral science. Starts with research. So it is about diagnosing the problem via a behavioral lens. So we identified in this particular phase, we identified target behaviors, we look at behavioral barriers, and we make recommendations for interventions based on the localized research that we carry out. We then use that research to develop the campaign. We are ultimately all about making sure audiences pay attention, that they understand the message, ultimately take action. We are, to our knowledge, the only agency in the UK who has embedded experimentation into all campaigns. So all our campaigns before they're activated are qualitatively and quantitatively, well, ideal situation, qualitatively and quantitatively tested. But when we're working at pace, or if budget constraints are there, we quantitatively test it. We run randomized trials to really give that confidence to our client that our ideas, our creative messages will land with audiences when we launch. Then we activate the campaign, and we also monitor in real time to make any adjustments, which is one of the reasons our campaigns continue to succeed. And then ultimately we look at evaluation, and we look at what we set out to achieve, what was the objective, and did communications tangibly contribute towards solving that. So in this particular case, I think our communications objectives were to reach these 667,000-ish audiences, and that very specific number is based on local population data. We also wanted to generate 1.5% engagement rate, which was also based on sector averages, as well as the work we've done with them before. 6,000 clicks to our campaign website in 4 weeks. And again, justification was around the sector benchmarks that were available around conversion. And ultimately, we wanted to improve vaccination rates. So we had baseline figures when we started the campaign. Our research insights that we carried out prior to starting this piece of work in England generally indicated that young people felt scapegoated and did not feel recognized for the sacrifices they had made during the pandemic. They were deeply anchored to believing at the start of the pandemic that they weren't at risk. And obviously the Delta variant then changed the narrative, and it was very transmissible in young people. And that sort of shift, the behavior had sort of locked in. And so we were trying to undo this anchoring that already taken place. Young people were also quite hesitant and had concerns about specific issues and long-term effects of the vaccine, fertility, etc. There was this big sense of inertia in young people as well, because they were quite accustomed to the current state of affairs. And also present bias was a big behavioral barrier that was in place, where they were drawn to the immediate gains of going to a pub, perhaps, than going to get their vaccine, making them particularly passive when it came to accessing the vaccine. And they continue to display a level of stoicism and sacrifice. Qualitatively, we've heard things like, I'll give up my spot to allow someone more vulnerable to get the vaccine. So those are the insights that we already had. And some of these insights we packaged up and we ran a blog about it as well. We shared with the wider communications industry. So in terms of that's still as Lynn PR, I should say Lynn behavioral data and data insights into Southeast London audiences over time indicated that there was complacency in this group, high levels of distrust around institutions, and there was also a lot of confusion. And then we had data points from our client as well, which looked at a need for clarity about the risk factors associated with the vaccine, a need to better understand the variants and how new variants work with vaccines. And for many, this was the first time they were making a vaccination choice for themselves. And that is something that we had to fold into our consideration. So using the BCW COM-B models, we specified the target behaviors and the barriers to action. We wanted to move young Southeast Londoners from intent to action, and to engage with their target audiences and persuade them to adopt or maintain the target behavior. So there was also the second vaccine that we were trying to encourage take up of. We needed to better understand them and really assess the informational, structural and cognitive barriers that were in place that were stopping people from taking the vaccine. And so we had four key, there was a lot more than this, but four key barriers from a psychological perspective was optimism bias. I'm not overconfidence bias. I'm not going to catch COVID. I'm fit, I'm young, I'll be fine. Risk perception, this has been in play, hyperbolic discounting throughout the pandemic, especially for younger people. At the start of the pandemic, we go through described risk because we've never experienced COVID-19 before. And so when we're told by authority that this is a dangerous virus and we need to stay indoors, stay safe, we believe that and we are more compliant. But as we live with the risk over time, we experience it. And perhaps experiencing it, we are not catching COVID-19. So we then tend to push our boundaries of risk. So risk perception is a big piece of the puzzle for us. Status quo bias, which is the whole inertia piece I talked about earlier, and social norms. I'm just going to put my phone on mute. And social norms where they weren't seeing young people around them accessing the vaccine. So that was having a negative effect on their own behaviors. So despite delivering at pace, we ensured that this integrated campaign was representative of our communities, and we ensured there was a gender ethnicity representation. We had primary audiences that were based on age segments, and that's those segments are because of the vaccine data points that were available, so we could assess the effectiveness of communications. And then we were also targeting postcodes where take-up was low to really go into that sort of hyperlocal targeting. We also, in every campaign we run, we look at the reference network because we don't, as individuals, make decisions in a vacuum. We're very influenced by people around us, our friends, our family, our peers. So it's really important to not just speak to our audience, but their reference network as well. And then we had secondary audiences of, public sector organizations, educational institutions, businesses, community leaders, etc. So all the research that we've done in this space, we knew that we needed to empower young people to make the right choice. So we leveraged this concept of freedom and repositioned vaccines from a threat to personal freedom to a proactive, positive choice. So there was a lot of protect your community messaging out there. And that's where that fatigue was setting in, because that message had lost relevance. And we knew in order to cut through, we need to position the personal benefit of vaccination, especially with this audience. So we actually played on that and said, do it for going to the pub, do it for going on holiday, do it for going to the spa. And that was one of the biggest, most successful interventions that we created. And I know that following our work, which was recognized by the government, it was recognized by NHS England as well, our work, some of the campaign materials went England-wide. You may have used it yourself in your communications, but that sort of messaging then filtered through to other campaigns, which was great to see. So we harnessed, as I said, the power of personal benefits, alongside the health benefits, of course, to incentivize and motivate young people to access the vaccine quickly. The creative side of it was strategically to connect vaccination with personal benefit. We needed to rise above the noise of all the other public health messaging that was happening at the time, locally, London-wide, UK-wide, etc. And then we needed to actively promote vaccine from a positive lens. I do have the video, but I'm not going to play it because I think I'm going to have to go out of my, but I can put it in the chat after if you'd like to see. So we created this campaign video. This is the video that NHS England commissioned us to create for an England-wide audience. So I hope some of you've seen this or used it. And this video was instrumental, I think, in getting that message across really quickly. So we developed this video for use across social. It was used across digital channels. It was used on video on demand. We also then developed shorter clips that we could use across other channels. Experimentation. So as I said, the Lynn Framework has experimentation embedded into it. We usually run several trials, minimum of 3 when we run a campaign, but because we had a 1-week turnaround on this, it was really hard to run trials because of the urgency. So we tested behavioral frames. So we wanted to understand, based on the segments that we'd identified, what particular behavioral lever would be most effective. And it won't be surprising if you look at it. We had the control message, which was the sort of safety and security current messaging at the time about protecting yourself and your community. And we treated that with variants of social proof, prompt, and loss aversion. And as we can see, the youngest in the audience, the 18 to 29-year-olds, were influenced by social proof. So to understand and to see others run them were performing the target behavior would inspire them and persuade them to access the vaccine. Those aged 30 to 39 needed a prompt because they're more likely to forget, I suppose, because of being busy in their lives. And we found that the loss lens was really successful in our experiments with our ethnic minorities. So very quickly on PESO, so on paid, we had ads on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, we had video ads on Facebook, we had audio ads on Spotify, DAX, we had video on demand, looking at ITV and Sky, and then we also had a filter on Snapchat. On owned, we had lots of owned content on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat. We hosted a couple of Instagram live Q&A sessions. We did set up a Nextdoor account because it was really difficult to get approval in time by Nextdoor and get that sorted. And we optimized our campaign landing page, which is bottom left, which is now, if you go onto it, nhsselvax.com is a microsite, it's a full microsite with intelligent choice architecture. And what I mean by that is the decision-making environment for individuals. And a choice architecture could be a physical space, so where you see nudges, in a physical space, but it could be a digital space like a website as well. So we look at understanding how best to drive individuals to reflect on choices with behavioral design. On shared, we created a campaign toolkit. We shared that with partner organizations. It was really important for us to have buy-in and partnership with them for this campaign to succeed. It was all umbrellaed under the hashtag Don't Miss Your Vaccine. And the Mayor of London shared our content quite frequently, which is really helpful. So what? So this is where when we talk at Lynn about being outcomes focused and measurement obsessed, it's great to reach people. It's great to, even better to engage people, but ultimately, did they take action? And is that attributable back to communications? So we had KPIs, as I said, set at the beginning. We had baseline of vaccine take-up as well. And we can see here that we reached 2.2 million people, which generated in turn 5 million impressions. This is all over 4 weeks, by the way. We had an engagement rate of 2.4%. I think the baseline, the sector average for health is 0.8% on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, I believe. And then clicks, 30,000 tracked link clicks through to our campaign landing page, which generated 34,500 sessions. And our video, our campaign video, was viewed 272,000 times, of which 100,000 were through plays. So, and this is the so what. So we were able to evidence then a 77.8% increase versus baseline for 18 to 29-year-olds, and a 10.8% increase versus baseline for 30 to 39-year-olds as well. And with BAME audiences, all BAME rates increase faster since campaign activations than those of white ethnicity. And that's it from me. I'd happily take any questions. Let me stop sharing.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Shayoni. Just one thing I was going to ask, you mentioned the BCW and COM-B models. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's the behavior change wheel, BCW, and COM-B is capability, opportunity, motivation equals behavior.
So can people get more about those somewhere?
Yeah, so there's a book from Susan Mickey, which I think is called The Behavior Change Wheel. And that book outlines this methodology. It's not just about communications. The BCW includes communications, policy, a whole suite of other areas and interventions. But the COM-B model it's a really good workbook. I recommend it. It talks you through how you do a COM-B analysis.
Brilliant. So fantastic. Loads and loads of
looking at the
loads of chat.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Great it all is. If you can see that there.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at questions. I've got one here. Given that popular belief is to avoid negative language, why did you go for the don't miss your vaccine rather than a more positive get your vaccine or similar?
I don't think it's a negative message. It's a loss message, and loss aversions, prospect theory is a very, very instrumental part of behavior change, in that we are more motivated by loss than we're motivated by gain. When we know we're going to lose something, we're more likely to take action. So a don't miss frame is always extremely, extremely successful. And we found that over and over again in public health.
Brilliant. I can see a question more. Yeah. Please do put your questions in. I was going to ask, and it's quite interesting that COVID has been like the subject of most of the case studies today. And I was wondering if that has sped up the use of behavioural science in communications.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I think the pandemic showed that traditional models of communications were perhaps not as effective, and more innovative solutions were required. Obviously, behavioural science was instrumental in how governments across the world were responding to the crisis, and will be instrumental as we come out of this and go into recovery. And we're seeing that now. So the salience of behavioural science has never been higher. So I think absolutely we were there, right place, right time. Because the UK government was doing quite a lot on behavioural science, I think there was an appetite across the country from public sector organisations to equally access that expertise. And we're lucky to be one of the very few consultancies out there that provide an academic, robust solution. I suspect we were cheaper than the likes of Ogilvy, which was always a good thing. But yeah, right place, right time.
So do you have to have a certain amount of budget, do you think, to be able to do this properly?
I mean, I did it in-house. So my background is not agency. I was in-house public sector. I don't know, I popped in whilst you were introducing me, so I don't know if you actually shared, but I was at Cardiff University before I started Lynn, and I was running RCTs by the time I left in-house with no consultancy support. The challenge is in our community, in our communications community, there is a lack of capability. And that lack of capability is not because there isn't an appetite or interest. We know there is an appetite and interest, but there's a capacity issue, right? So people are flat out in public sector. And so to be able to keep on top of behavioral science requires a certain commitment and dedication to CPD, which perhaps colleagues don't have time to do. But we ran the BS monitor, which was the first pulse check of behavioral science capability and adoption and communications. And what we found was really interesting. So we had a 85 sample, which is not massive, but it was a very high quality sample. So we knew the people who were taking the survey were extremely well known in our industry. And we asked them to self-report their own understanding of behavioral science, their own usage of behavioral science, all of that. So that was self-report. And this is where we see, this is where sometimes it's really interesting to monitor how people think and perceive themselves versus how they actually are or behave. So once they self-reported their own capabilities, we took them through some vignettes where we gave them behavioral science questions, and they had to assess what intervention was in play, et cetera, et cetera. And so that then helped us understand really what the actual capability was. And when you look at the actual capability versus the perceived capability, it drops to about 2%. So it's actually really low from that piece of work we did. So you can do it in-house, is what I'm trying to say. I suspect there's a capacity issue. I suspect there's a capability issue. If you were to work with the likes of us, we are having to put into place parameters on fees because we have to run the business. But we're always very flexible. We look at budgets. If we can't do a full-blown campaign like this one, and this one was an expensive campaign, we will look at what other solutions. Is it a digital campaign? Is it research? How can we help? So we always want to help. So there will always be a solution. It may not be the solution that we initially started the discussion with, but it does end up hopefully in a partnership.
Okay, but I know you're very keen not to cut corners, aren't you, in terms of? And
that's why we need the fees. That's the biggest thing for me is as we scale up, we've gone from being a 4-person to a nearly 30-person agency. We are in the UK with the fastest growing communications business in the UK right now. And for us to keep the authenticity and academic rigor requires investment in the team, investment in our learning and development, and that doesn't come cheap. So for us to be ahead of the game, we do need to charge a premium to be able to provide that service back. But the value, so if you speak to any of our clients, look at the value that we bring versus the cost of our services is always very high. So to be able to drive 77.8% improvement in vaccine take-up in 4 weeks, that is the value that we brought to that campaign.
And is there a big issue you think there's going to be, like obviously COVID kind of was just there and we had to deal with that, but are there particular issues that you see that behavioural science is going to be used more for?
Behavioural science is a methodology. It can be used across anything and everything. It's as expansive as communications. So there's no real limit in how and where behavioural science can be used. I certainly think this is why we introduced those 3 practice areas of Lynn Health, Lynn Climate, and Lynn Change. The climate emergency is a big one, and I think that's where we want to translate our success in public health into the climate space to be able to create a very different solution than what's out there. It's not just about campaigns and awareness. How do you get individuals to change behaviors on climate, and how do you get them to actually make that happen? Because there's a big capability barrier right now in the climate agenda.
Great. We've got quite a few questions that come in now. So when you had to work so quickly, how did you identify essential factors in the audience landscape so fast? You mentioned finding relevant spheres of influence for the young people you were targeting. Organically or using a tool, or is this something you already had information on?
How did we, so I'm looking at the question again, essential factor. So we don't use any tools. We run everything in-house, it's all human. We had a lot of data insights in Southeast London because we've done quite a lot of, there's Laura. We've done quite a lot of communications and campaigns in Southeast London. So we had a lot of data insights into different segments of the audience and different behaviors, different barriers. We'd also done that primary research, as I said, across England on COVID-19 and young people. So we had those data insights. So we fused them really quickly, and then we experimented, and then we monitored in real time to make sure that interventions, which were very quick, and typically they're not that quick, like we like to take a bit of time, at least a couple of weeks, not 1 week. So we then monitored that in time to make sure that the recommendations that we'd come up with so quickly, the very one quick RCT that we ran, were they translating throughout the lifespan of 4 weeks? Does that, hopefully that answers your question, Ruth, but let me know if not.
I think you probably did. So you've got a round of applause here for turning this campaign around in a week. How did you do that?
Oh my God.
It
was never again, never again. It was painful. It was really, really painful. But we knew we needed to support. It was one of our oldest clients. They mean everything to us. So I was actually on holiday. It was my husband's birthday and we'd gone to London. I ended up working throughout the whole period. Everyone worked flat out. We worked pretty much 20-hour days. We were lucky that we had the insights. So that really gave us that head start, both locally and then on the issue. And our client trusted us immensely. So they took our advice on everything. So it wasn't a difficult client by any means. So a combination of trust from clients and existing research and a real determination from our team to support, I think, but it was painful.
Right. And as a thank you here for championing public sector comms team, the question is, as a result of the pandemic, did you use any different comms channels or use any channels differently in order to adapt?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use Snapchat quite a lot. And so the Don't Miss campaign, that was for 4 weeks, but we're still working on it. So it was so successful that we spun it into a pregnancy work stream, into children, young people work stream, 5 to 11 vaccines, and the evergreen offer. So it's still ongoing. So it's now there's brand identity and brand equity that we've created. So Snapchat, we did quite a lot of stuff on. It was really interesting. It got the most traction. And when we did the 12 to 15 segment for later on, Snapchat was incredibly successful for us. We did Instagram stories, Instagram reels, Q&As on Instagram, on Facebook. So I'm talking more generally, not just this 4-week campaign. I'm just saying the Don't Miss campaign. Nextdoor was really, really good for us in terms of local reach. That was free. We started dabbling in the metaverse as well. So that's a really interesting space that we're looking at. So we did a lot of new, and we continue to work with new channels. But I think ultimately it's about really understanding which channel is catering for which audience, and then monitoring that, the effectiveness of the content on that channel. That's the only way it's going to succeed. So we every single day, every single campaign, every single segment of every single campaign is monitored by my team manually to really understand whether the messages are still working. And then so we're very agile. So if something stops working, we can really switch at very, very short notice. What's the average age of your staff? I have a young team. Can you tell? I have a young team. Yeah, they do make me feel really old. But that's why we're on these channels. And it was a young person's campaign, so it did really well. But yeah, we do have a young team, but we have a senior leadership team, shall we say? Yeah. So you've got to target pensioners. You'd be we've done that. We've worked on vaccine, like flu vaccination campaigns, where we've targeted, and we've done other stuff with over 65s. We actually found them quite engaged when we did it. Surprisingly, I believe when we ran the first flu campaign for the same client pre-pandemic, they were the most engaged segment digitally, which is really interesting. Oh, that is interesting, isn't it? And Sally Howe is asking, given the success of this campaign in the locality, has it been adapted for other geographies? And what was the budget? I can't share the budget without the consent of my client, obviously. It wasn't a cheap campaign. It was, and that was because we were advertising quite a lot. So when we look at the whole campaign, we've done cinema advertising, we've done out of home, we've done, it's a big campaign. So but the reason they invested in us is because they saw the success that the campaign was driving. So the business case was not difficult to make. Sorry, remind me of the question again. I'm going to quickly open the Q&A. Has it been? Yes, it has been. It was so. So it got drilled down into the Royal Borough of Greenwich, who wanted to localize the campaign. So we took the campaign identity, we ran photo shoots, and we really talked about like the Greenwich story through the Don't Miss Your Vaccine creative lens. It got, as I said, picked up by NHS England. And so the TV ad that we created, we recreated that and went England wide. So we localized it and then we nationalized it as well.
And then finally, we've got Nick Price Thompson wants to know if you'd like a job.
What's that? Do I what?
Do you want a job?
Do you want a job? Where would I want a job? Well, do you want a job at Lynn? I mean, we're always looking for people.
Oh, there's an offer. There's an offer. How do people contact you if they'd like a job?
Oh, absolutely. Please write to us. contact@lynn.global. Our website is lynn.global. And if you go on our website, you'll see the campaign video as well on there. The Don't Miss campaigns there as well. So yeah, no, absolutely. It's brilliant to work with public sector teams. That's been my life forever. And this is a whole new life for me. And to be able to demonstrate that back, that it is possible. You know, you may not be able to do it yourself, but there are people out there who can help. And you may be able to do it yourself, but there is a commitment, and being very honest about what the commitment looks like. I'm sure Laura will back me up about the CPD in behavioral science.
She will, of course.
There we go.
That is brilliant. Thanks so much, Shayoni, because I know you're trying to get loads done to go off on holiday tomorrow. So thanks so much for
You're very welcome.
Your time and your brilliant expertise and enthusiasm. So I'm going to hand back to Ruth now to run the panel.
Thanks, Judith, and thanks, Shayoni. Oh my goodness, I think we're all blown away yet again. Each of you this afternoon has just been amazing. You set such a high standard. That was a really, really impressive campaign. But again, like we saw before, I just love the rigor with the use of very clear, logical frameworks, being very disciplined, making sure that everything's been properly thought through, that you're doing the measurement, the evaluation. I love the testing. You know, it's yeah, you set a gold standard that I'm sure all of us on the call really aspire to. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Laura, for coming back in to join our panel, and yeah, thank you both of you for just being willing to hang on. Maybe just another. We're going to finish at 5, so maybe just another 20 minutes or so, depending how many questions come up, just so that we can have a bit more of a relaxed panel discussion really around the topic. So first of all, I've got a few questions to get us started, but please, everyone, if you have additional questions or as you listen to the discussion, you're prompted to add further thoughts, comments, questions, do use the Q&A for that. We would really welcome that. I think it's hard to know where to start, actually. I think probably it's already been said that, not surprisingly, really, given what we've just come out of, a lot of this afternoon has been quite pandemic focused. Behavioural science obviously had a really key role to play in comms around that. And we've certainly, it's true to say, isn't it, that the last 2 years, we've probably seen the most concentrated shift in collective behaviour for at least a generation. So really, off the back of that, I just want to ask you both for your views. Do you agree that we should absolutely be harnessing behavioural insights to embed the societal changes that we want to stick, but also on the other side to tackle new problems that have arisen or perhaps indeed become worse in the last 2 years? Is this a tool that we really should be taking to heart and using for driving positive social change?
Imagine one of us would say no at this point.
Well, right, of course.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. Otherwise, I would probably argue against my own existence. But I think the beauty of behavioral science, from my perspective, is that I literally am yet to come across a problem where behavioral science doesn't contribute, because most problems in this world are both caused by and to be solved by humans. Mm-hmm. Right? And once we appreciate that, behavioral science is literally relevant to everything. And of course, it has in the past demonstrated its strength in the health sector. And that's not for a coincidence. I think when you look at public health, behaviors are usually quite clear. You want people to wash their hands. You want them to get vaccinated and so on. So behavioral science has in the past done really well on those topics, particularly because the evidence that is generated on them, how can we get people to do X, is usually is not as context dependent as other behaviors. If we're thinking now about cost of living, right? You start off from a perspective where you go, oh, crap, where do we even start? There's so many different behaviors, right? And I'm really excited for behavioral science to move into the space where way before we've determined any keen, clear behavior, behavioral scientists shape the questions and think about the web of behaviors that exist and where to intervene as the good systems thinkers that we are. So yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think there's lots to come and I'm here for it.
Great. Shayoni,
couldn't agree more, right?
Yeah.
Imagine if he said no. And this is when I said earlier about it being a methodology and being limitless. It can be applied across anything that we can think of, because ultimately, as Laura says, we're humans, and behavioral sciences is about understanding human behavior and helping humans make better choices by understanding their behavior. So yeah, I think one of the key takeaways for me is being able to understand what problem you're trying to solve and what behavior you're trying to influence. I think behavior change is a very easy thing to say. This is a behavior change campaign, but is it? Because a lot of the behavior change campaigns we see are perhaps awareness campaigns because they're not really driving behavior, because they haven't identified the target behavior and the multitude of actions required to get to that target behavior. So in order to effectively run a behavioral science campaign, it's very important to have behaviors at the end, but being able to identify what those actions are and how you're influencing those actions along the way.
What I'm hearing from you both is, first of all, absolutely, it might have had particular application in healthcare, but it's absolutely something you're expecting to see bleeding out across all sectors. And really, when we stop to think about it as comms professionals, what are all comms campaigns about but driving some kind of a change of a behavior, ultimately some kind of whether it's adoption, awareness. So I guess you would both argue that really all of us, and I can hear the collective grow in the background because our profession's ever expanding and we're ever expected to do even more, but really while there'll always be specialists like yourselves who can take it to the next level, that really all of us need to sort of start embodying these principles a bit more in our everyday campaigns. Really.
The thing is that you're doing it already, and that's the thing. I think as communicators, we're instinctively about understanding human behavior. And if you look at your content where you've got things in bold, you're using behavioral science. It may be that you don't know you're using interventions for a reason. And I think by understanding what behavioral science is, how it can help you, when I say you, I mean our collective community, then we can use those interventions more strategically instead of sort of stabbing in the dark.
I think that's the key thing that I'm taking home from this is, I think a lot of us have got those finitude instincts, and you're right, in a way we're kind of doing it almost on autopilot, but we're probably not doing it consciously enough. We're not being rigorous enough in our use of, like you've shown so clearly, using those very clear models, those frameworks, and then being very clear and disciplined about making sure that we're evaluating and measuring as well. I guess perhaps just about being a bit more grown up and confident in our use of it. So thank you. That's really helpful. There's some questions coming through, which I promise I will circle back to those in a minute. Before we do, the next thing I want to ask you about was bias in samples. I was doing a little bit of research ahead of today. I came across social scientist Joe Heinrich's work and his book, The Weirdest People in the World. I don't know whether you know about that. And he talks about being wary of generalizing from weird. So weird standing for Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic samples that are frequently used in academic studies, going back to the kind of core academic research that underpins this area. So I guess the big question is, how do we allow for cross-cultural divergence in the effects of behavioral interventions? Laura,
very good question. It's a very good behavioral science question. And then you can see Laura itching to respond to that.
Good, I'm glad.
Yeah, happy to go for it. So when I outlined in my talk earlier that the field has some troubles, the field of psychology that is, then it also touched on that. So we have in psychology what we call the replication crisis, right? So even with our weird samples, a lot of the effects actually don't replicate. So we need to be really cautious of that. But then, yeah, of course, the big issue is, and that's kind of what prompted me to set Behavioural, my own team up in such a different way, is I get some effects on like some nice fun intervention that worked in a laboratory in the States with 20-year-old girls that study psychology, because usually those are the samples, right? So when we're talking weird, we're talking a subset of weird. Usually it's psychology students because they're cheap to get. And then I have this intervention from the psychology students, and I'm thinking about my benefit claimants in the UK. I would be mad if I would go down that route and just translate those findings, right? Which is why what I've been advocating for a very long time is to actually not go with these preset interventions that have or haven't worked elsewhere, as long as we don't understand well enough why and where they work. In other words, we're often not quite clear from the findings in psychology to which context do they actually generalize, right? Because we often actually don't understand the mechanisms well enough. So for that reason, what is bulletproof though is the methodology. What's bulletproof is the process you go through. You start from a behavior, you understand the barriers, and COM-B as a framework has no such restrictions. It works across all cultures. Just yesterday, I used it with the Ghanaian tax authority. It works across anything, and it's free of the knowledge on how to influence, but moves you to an understanding of how to understand. It moves you towards a place where you can try and understand behaviors, and that's universal.
I think that's absolutely spot on. And that's why at Lynn, we experiment, because behavior is about context and replication crisis is a real thing. So Southeast London, where we worked 2.5 years, we still experiment every single time, because an intervention worked yesterday has no guarantee it's going to work today. So it's really important then to have the experimentation built in.
And as you demonstrated in your campaign, Shayoni, as well, just making sure that you're using the right insights. You're looking at the right, and like you're saying, Laura, like just use your common sense, like just check what is the origin of that data that you're looking at. Does it actually make sense?
Yeah, so I think the more important bit actually is to ask the right question, understand your problem well enough, because the better an understanding you have of your problem, the more you can also tell whether or not the intervention that has worked elsewhere could possibly address the barriers that your own audience has faced. Right. So I would heavily weigh the understanding of the problem over the scientific evidence, like scientific expertise to dissect these studies. No one is going to expect that of you.
So guess what? Surprise, surprise! It's about knowing your audience really well, which again is a basic. I mean, this is like basic comm stuff, but just remembering that perhaps. Especially when you're working at speed, under pressure, and perhaps feeling a bit panicky, because this is, I'm guessing for a lot of people in this call, this is quite a new area, which is why I think we've got such a high level of interest. And when it's new, there's a quite high level of kind of concern, and we're definitely going to get on to like lots of kind of questions in that area, like how do I get up to speed with this, training and all of that. So yeah, just remembering to use what we do know, that we just have to start with our audience, like trying to get into their heads, really understand the issues we're trying to unpack.
I think it's a step further, step backwards, if that makes sense. Is what is the problem that we're trying to solve? I think that is critical before we even go into audiences. What is the problem? Will help define the target behavior, will then help define the outcomes. So when I say actually the measures, outcome measures. So, and then that loops back into evaluation and effectiveness and attribution. So really distilling into what is the problem will help identify the behaviors that we're trying to influence.
Taking notes. This is great. Thank you. I feel like we could talk about that all day, but I'm going to move on. So I don't think this would be a good panel discussion without touching on the big ethics question, which has already come up at least once this afternoon, as I would expect, as we have very good quality audience on the call. So we've heard a lot about the benefits of using behavioural science in our comms, but yeah, what about the ethics involved? I suppose more specifically, because Laura, you've already answered a question on this, but what I want to talk about is the tipping point. At what point does the use of behavioural science potentially tip towards, dare I say it, I mean, heaven forbid, and not on your watch, I know, but just playing devil's advocate here, just knowing what the counter criticisms can be. That tipping point towards a coercive manipulation of your target audience, especially with government-sponsored public campaigns, and even taking it to the extreme, propaganda. And I know that a perception that something might be in that camp is subjective. So that's a challenge too. Like, at what point can you objectively say, no, this has crossed a boundary? So yeah, your views on that.
Can I just quickly take that, because I know that Laura has some very rich insights on this, because we had a discussion about this very recently. I think what I always say, because I was smiling because I get this question a lot, as you can imagine, as does Laura. My perspective is that behavioral science is a science. A science is in the hands of the applicator. You can use science to build a bomb. You can use science to create life-saving medicine, right? So it's up to us as practitioners, just like we do in communications, where we have a code of conduct. We need to be ethical, and we are the guardians of that. It's up to us as practitioners to ensure that we are applying the science ethically. For Lynn and for me, it's about agency. So it's never about taking away choice. It's about giving agency to our audience. So we work at Lynn, we work towards our audience. They are primary. They're primary for us, right? So it's about ensuring that they see choices in different ways, but ultimately the decision of what they're going to do is still with them. We're not forcing anyone to go get a vaccine. We're presenting choices in the most effective way, so they will consider and then make the best decision for them. And maybe that they don't get the vaccine, and that's the best decision for them. We are not manipulating. So we're firmly about education and persuasion, never about manipulation. So that's my camp. But I know Laura also has very interesting and rich views.
Thank you. Yeah. So basically, if you're working in government, for a start, there's a question around the aims that you have, as Shayoni just said, right? Are they ethical? And that is way beyond behavioral science. So that has nothing to do with me. That's kind of, the elected government setting the aims. What, of course, has to do with us is to surface where those aims might lead to unintended outcomes or inequalities or anything like that. So we're there to surface, but ultimately the aims are part of the decision makers, which then brings us on to, are we using methods that are unethical, right? I would argue that if you're thinking behavioral science is unethical, you probably also should think that PR is unethical as a more general practice, because actually there's very little difference in the sense that you want people to do something, right? I'm probably not in the camp of, I couldn't say behavioral science doesn't restrict choice, because as behavioral scientists in government, we are working on legislation also. And legislation is, rules and regulations and so on. So it does sometimes put a boundary on it. So my aim is here to make sure that this legislation is designed around user needs and is designed in a way that we don't introduce sludge, for instance. I would find sludge very unethical. And you can see that, whenever you're trying to have like a insurance claim, you'll be presented with sludge, and government systems should definitely not do that. So you can reverse engineer behavioral science to make stuff harder for people. And that's where personally I would always say no. And important here is that ultimately, through the use of behavioral science, but through the use of communication, through the use of good policy design, we shouldn't erode trust, because if we do that, we make our own job much harder. So it's for behavioral science to surface where any of the practices could erode trust and violate principles of perceived competence, transparency, or benevolence. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. This is, I'm kind of putting you a bit on the spot here, and feel free just to pass on this one. But I just wonder whether either of you actually have had situations where, perhaps you want to go into specifics, but where you've had that ethical call and you've had to kind of push back professionally and kind of go, actually, now I think we're nudging a line, and actually for these reasons, this is my recommendation. And
we have an ethical framework at the business. We're very fortunate because we can say no. So we are firmly, we are a purpose-driven business. Our mission is to improve and save lives. We have an ethical framework, and if it doesn't fit within that framework, we don't work with clients. So for example, would we work with a drinks company? Yes, if we are selling no to low alcohol, if we are changing behaviors for good. So we are fortunate to be able to do that. It's much difficult when you work in government, when you're working in the civil service. I'm going to let Laura respond to that.
Yeah, so we are civil servants, which means we are responding to aims that are set by people that have been democratically elected, right? And so I see our role as surfacing surfacing all unintended or intended consequences of something, saying how we could mitigate some of the risks, for instance, and so on. I think it's a really weird idea that behavioral science teams go, oh, no, I'm not working on that, because that's just not the reality, and we're working across all policies, and these might be people that I elect myself, or might be people that I don't elect myself. But I think for me as a person, actually, it's more interesting to work with people whose aims are far removed from possibly my own ideology, because that's interestingly where I can make the biggest difference, in the sense that if they have a very different viewpoint to me in how they can achieve aims, then surfacing my views has the biggest potential to showcase something someone has not thought of before. Thank you.
That's great. I suppose I was also sort of wondering, though, again, coming back to those of us on the call for whom this is all quite a new area, it's just thinking about, yeah, I suppose wondering what your advice would be in terms of helping us sort of draw up that kind of ethical framework, so that we feel kind of safe and confident to navigate it, especially while we're sort of early doors with it all feeling our way. What would your recommendation on that be?
It's something we're discussing at CIPR via PR panel.
Brilliant.
So it is something that I think should be incorporated into a code of conduct, whether it's CIPR, whether it's PRCA. We have in the behavioral science community GABS as well, which is looking at ethics. Ethics is a hot topic in the behavioral science world. The different frameworks that behavioral scientists use to make sure they're being ethical in their work. But I think it's something that it's a commitment you can make yourself. It's a document you can own yourself with your team. But there is a wider industry-wide issue of ensuring behavioral science gets integrated into our practice codes.
Thank you.
I wouldn't be held up too much by the question, I think, more generally, for you. Unless you want to draw out the whole issues with PR and ethics, and kind of then you start to question, should we give people information to influence their behavior, and if so, to what aims, and who decides what aims are good, and so on. It's really tricky philosophically. I think you will feel yourself if you feel like you suddenly cross a line, if you, I don't know, manipulating someone really, really intensely, but like that, I reckon that none of us have really the tools at hand to do something that would cross like that.
Yeah. And it's for us as a profession to lead the way. It's like, I agree with what you say, Shayoni. It's a tool, and it can be used for good and it can be used for ill. And certainly as members of the CIPR, we're governed by the code of conduct, and ethics is a big part of that. And so it's nothing to be afraid of, it's something to embrace, but just make sure that we're clear and confident about using it in the right way. So thank you for your comments on that. Okay, I promised we'd get to the questions. We're running out of time. All on a similar theme, not surprisingly, I think people are looking for help, guidance from you, both in terms of kind of getting along in this area. So, okay, in no particular order. So Kelly is asking, are there any other behavioural science books, blogs, podcasts the panel would recommend? Thank you so much to everyone today, she adds.
Can I go? Yeah. So introductory reading to anybody coming into this field is Nudge, the old version, Nudge, the new version, Nudge, the final edition. The BIT book by David Halpern, God, can't remember his name, Inside the Nudge Unit. Cialdini's books on persuasion. I think those are the very introductory books out there. Podcast-wise, introductory podcasts, I'd say Choiceology by Katie Milkman is really good. There's a whole host of other behavioral science podcasts, but that one is really, really interesting. It very easy to understand. It really decodes a lot of the academic principles really well. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, definitely agree with Cialdini. But I reckon a lot of you will also realizing that a lot of that you've already been doing throughout your professional practice. I think it's quite well embedded in your profession. I'm not such a fan of Nudge. You can make your own opinions, and it's certainly helpful to view it as a historic piece. So where it all started as a really important thing. And also in line of that, I do enjoy Richard Thaler a lot as an author, and he's written Misbehaving.
Yeah. That's really good.
I really like that. There's also
Anna Really,
but he's recently been not so ethical, has he been?
Yeah, true.
So I probably wouldn't go there. I have one at the tip of my head, which I'll post in the chat in a second. I remember it.
Yeah.
About how poor people make decisions, which I think is quite an important one, just to understand how it's applied to a subset of the population that some might struggle to engage with.
I think two things is you commented on weird community. So the weirdest people in the world is definitely, if you're interested in understanding weird better. And on Nudge, I think it's really important. And I say this all the time, Nudge is not behavioral science. It's a particular methodology within the discipline, and behavioral science is very expensive. Not just about behavioral design, if anything, it's about choice architecture and understanding those decision-making environments and how best to create design choices that will help people look at choices differently. So and choice architecture. So if you're a communicator, you're a choice architect. So I think from a comms perspective, I totally get where Laura's coming from. From a comms perspective, I think it's easy to translate into our work, the book. But I've not yet read the final edition. It's on my audio list for my holiday.
Thank you. And obviously we could try and decipher from afterwards playing back the audio, but if you could bear while you're still on the call just to quickly drop into chat some of those ideas, that would be really very much appreciated. But we'll try and collate a list of resources for people as well. Moving quickly on, so question for the panel: behaviour change science is complex. There's so much to know and understand. How easy is it to get it wrong for some with less expertise? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, that question. As practitioners with a little knowledge, should we be wary that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing? So come on, guys, encourage us not to get too scared that we're going to get it wrong.
No, so I think there's a really easy way to not do that. So I've spoken about throughout the day. You could have told that there's kind of like a little aversion for me to use insights that have worked elsewhere and just apply them in your own setting without understanding it. So in the sense that you can have kind of two kinds of frameworks or books almost in behavioral science. You have the solution-focused frameworks and books, which is kind of the East Framework, Mindspace, and so on. These are kind of effects on how to get people to do what we want. I would not, as a novice, apply any of that, because in the end, you don't know if it works, it could backfire, and you don't understand it well enough. So ignore this for a second. I personally am not such a fan anyway. I wouldn't even use it as an expert. Then, as a novice, using the frameworks, combi, you can't really go much wrong. You'll always probably get more out of it than if you hadn't applied it. Actually, to define behaviors is something that, it takes a little bit of practice to get into the mindset, but you are probably already semi there. Again, I would really say, start by defining behaviors, start by understanding barriers, the rest will follow.
Great, thanks. Shayoni?
100%. I think if you can sort out capability and opportunity, motivation always follows. So it's combi is such a critical piece to this. And I think, but I will say that I don't think you can go wrong with it, but you may not apply it effectively to its full use. Certainly don't think by having little knowledge you will manipulate or create propaganda. So don't worry about that. But the reason I set up Lynn from public sector was I found that commercially in the agency world, there's a lot of talk of behavior change and behavioral science, and lots of agencies claim to do it, but it's very superficial. They've read the books that we've just talked about, very introductory, and they use the same interventions over and over again, social proof, blah, 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 and it stops having an effect, right? So it is a very rich area, and it needs nuance and expertise. And so whilst you might not go wrong, by doing a superficial job from a commercial perspective, doesn't do the behavioral science community any good, and it really undervalues the discipline and what it can achieve. So if you want to get into it, commit to it like I did. I fell into a rabbit hole, and I am not a behavioral scientist, Laura is. I'm an applied behavioral practitioner. So I went into a rabbit hole and I really committed to my CPD. And so just keep that commitment if you want to do it, or accept that you're not going to be a behavioral scientist and you're going to apply loose principles and run combi, and that's better than nothing.
Great, thank you. A couple of people are also asking about the idea of perhaps there being like a standard module on behavioral science in comms courses, and or like introducing a qualification for comms practitioners in applied strict upstream behavioral science. I mean, yeah, clearly you're not going to do anything other than applaud that idea, right?
No, and it's something we're looking at CIPR anyway, for CIPR and PR. Yeah. And Laura works closely with John as well, Dr. John White. It's something that we're discussing as a panel, and how we bring in some training, some consistency, and some accreditation to behavioral science and communications.
Yeah. And then I think in the meantime, you've given us a whole list of useful resources that we can crack on with. I'm going to squeeze in one last question before we wrap, because I've promised everyone a 5 o'clock finish today. We've already had quite a long afternoon online, but this is a really good one. Thank you. It's anonymous. I can't credit the questioner. I'm really interested in how we can use behavioural science to drive positive change around EDI. I'm glad that came up. That needs to come up on a comms call. Have the panelists seen this done well anywhere?
I'm not sure that's the best question at the end, because it's how long is a string, really.
I know. We could have a whole topic on this, couldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely it can help in many ways, and it is being used. Some of it is being used in recruitment. There's a lot being used. We've worked with a civil service client where we use behavioral science to tackle very complex, sensitive issues within staff where they weren't, in certain respects, behaving in the ways I can't really talk about it very much, which is why I'm trying to cloak and dagger. But it can be used. It can be used very effectively internally and wider EDI efforts as well.
Yeah, I've seen it done very well, and we've been working on that too. I think it's kind of EDI, but there's also kind of, if we're expanding that a little bit, kind of further kind of inequalities, societal inequalities, but also obviously in recruitment processes, we can kind of internally, like it's called de-bias some of the processes. That's the start, but also actually, if you're taking a user-centered perspective to diversity and inclusion issues, you end up at a position where you end up defining behaviors, which we've not really done before. What does it actually mean to be inclusive? What kind of behaviors are we talking about? Then you can think about, why are they currently not already occurring? Is it really just a capability or motivational issue, or are there other systemic factors that need to be addressed? Definitely lots of scope to do more, but yeah, already been looked at. Great, thank you. We're going to have to call it a day. Thank you both, Shayoni and Laura, very much. That was a really fascinating conversation, and I felt like we could have carried on. Please, everyone, just hang about for 5 seconds. I just want to share a couple of slides before we wrap up for this afternoon. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Just going into, there we go. So yeah, just to remind you, a recording and slides we shared. Apologies, I think somehow in the break the recording stopped and we overlooked that, so I'm afraid we may not have recording of Michael's presentation, but we'll have his slides. And do remember, those of you who are CIPR members, you can log 5 CPD points for attendance this afternoon, so don't forget to do that. And we'd love to have your feedback. Please do share with us on Twitter, LinkedIn. Also, while I'm here, if you're a member and you're not already getting our newsletter, please do subscribe to that. We can't send to you, because of GDPR, of course, unless you've actually switched that on, and you do that by navigating to your preferences, log into your profile on the CIPR website, go to preferences, and make sure you select the East Anglia newsletter. What else do I want to share with you? Those of you who aren't members on the call, I know not all of you are, just a quick plug for joining the CIPR. It's very good value. It's a fantastic way of demonstrating your professional credibility, gives you access to training, development, networking. There's a fantastic range of resources online as well, and a great community of where you'll get a lot of support from fellow CIPR and comms professionals. So please do consider that as well. Those of you who are CIPR members will be aware of the annual Pride Awards that run across the regions every year, and this year's Pride Awards is currently open. The deadline is the 15th of June. It's an opportunity to showcase your work from the last year, loads of different categories, including, very excitingly, we're very proud this year to be introducing a new category for students, and that's free of charge to enter. So even if there are no students on this call, you may know students who would be interested. So please do pass the word on. And what else? I think that's probably just about it. If you sign up to our newsletter, as I say, you'll get our news and events coming to you via email on a regular basis. A little spoiler alert, we have got one event in planning already for the early autumn on speech writing, so watch this space for details. And last but not least, in the last couple of minutes, of course, a massive thank you to all our speakers.
for kindly giving up your time to share your valuable experience and insights with us. It's been a fascinating and engaging afternoon, and you've given us so much to absorb and think about. So a big round of virtual applause to you all. And of course, a massive thank you as well to my hardworking colleagues on the CIPR East Anglia Committee, without whom this event simply wouldn't have been possible. In particular, many thanks to Hayley Mace and Jude Gaskell, who led the event this year, and to Andrew Wilson for her live tweeting this afternoon. And of course, last but certainly not least, a final thank you to all of you who've taken time out of your busy diaries to attend and for helping to make the event a great success. We've really appreciated all your engagement in the chat and the Q&A. It's been fantastic fun, as well as a really informative afternoon. And we look forward to welcoming you to a future event. So with that, I will love and leave you. And in the meantime, I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much again for coming.